the women of Ireland who instead...
On December 3rd, 1990, Ireland saw its first female president sworn into office. To the still deeply Catholic nation, it was an earth-moving historical moment. Mary Robinson, during her inaugural speech, said,
"As a woman, I want women who have felt themselves outside history to be written back into history. In the words of Ivan Boland, finding a voice where they have found a vision."
Mary Robinson was born in County Mayo, Ireland, to 2 doctors, the only daughter among 4 brothers. Her parents would tell young Mary that she'd have the same opportunities as her brothers, but the reality was much different.
We were a very Catholic, religious family, so my brothers were altar boys. They served with the priest on the altar. There was no altar girl, and I hated wearing anything on my head, but I had to wear the awful scarves or hats in church. And looking out in society, I could see women had to resign from the civil service if they got married, and there were so many discriminations. So my parents were saying one thing, and our society was saying another. And I think that gave me a sense, I'm going to try and make it the way my parents wanted to be when I was a small child. And then it grew into a sense of justice.
During her teenage years, Robinson went to Paris for a year of study. The year made a deep impression on young Mary, who discovered that France was very open. Paris exposed her to ideas worlds apart from Ireland. Her perspective began to change.
Because I was in a different cultural environment, I was being taught by brilliant teachers about history, about culture, etc., very much from a French perspective. And I saw that France was trying to promote its culture throughout the country, not just in the capital. Whereas in Ireland, everything happened in Dublin and nothing in the country. When I came back to Ireland, I decided that the best way to try to change things was to study law.
With distinction, Robinson entered Trinity College, Dublin, a Christian school established by Queen Elizabeth I. However, Ireland was then still under Catholic control, so she needed Catholic Church approval to study there. Graduating from Trinity, she went on to Harvard Law School. It was 1960s America, and she was deeply moved by the young people actively engaging in public affairs.
My American contemporaries were criticizing an immoral war, and very significant things happened. The assassination of Martin Luther King in April, and then after I graduated, of Robert Kennedy. But actually, what impressed me even more and stayed with me was that young people, my contemporaries, were going to make a difference. And a lot of it, because they were my friends, were going to make a difference in poverty programs and civil rights in the south of the United States.
Returning to Ireland, Robinson, then 25, became the youngest Reed Professor of Law at Trinity. She knew that Irish youth tended to wait until later in life to advance and achieve prominence. But inspired by her time in America, Robinson set out to challenge this mindset. Representing Dublin University, she ran for a Seanad seat. Against expectations, with great effort, she beat the experienced male candidate and became one of a handful of young female senators. The first bill she proposed upon taking office was related to family planning.
I was elected at the age of 25, really with a very clear purpose, and the top of my agenda was to change the law on family planning because it was absurd. Married women couldn't avail of the contraceptive pill unless they had the written permission of their doctor because they had cycle regulation problems. And unmarried women couldn't avail of it at all. And there was a joke that many married women in Ireland had cycle regulation problems and they were blaming the weather.
Irish society, then still quite conservative, was unwilling to discuss such issues, especially contraception, clashing with Catholic doctrine. Her proposal stood in direct opposition to the Church. It was quickly blocked by the Seanad, and Robinson received much hate mail.
I found myself very much the victim of hate mail, not social media. There was no social media then, but letters through the post.
The next year, her proposal for amendment was considered, only making the situation worse. Veteran journalist Olivia O'Leary, who long covered Robinson, remembers that period vividly, because even Robinson's parents saw public humiliation.
For doing that, she became a target of vile criticism, really nasty attacks. And the Archbishop of Dublin came out and he said, contraception, he said, will be the curse of this country. And her local bishop in Ballina gave a sermon from the pulpit in Ballina Cathedral when her parents were there at Mass, condemning the legislation that Mary was trying to bring in. And her parents were so humiliated that they stood up and they walked out of the church. But in those days, if you suggested that the law on family planning on contraception should be changed, as a woman you were branded a prostitute, or even nastier, a whore. Mary got the most dreadful letters, and I won't even tell you what was enclosed in the letters. She burned them all.
All of this taught Robinson that if you want to defend your beliefs, you have to pay the price. Despite all the attacks, her proposal gained traction, sparking society-wide discussion.
The debate was significant, and then we introduced another bill later, and then eventually, 9 years after our first measure, the government introduced a rather limited measure, but it started the process of access to reproductive health and family planning.
Not only a senator, Robinson was also a constitutional lawyer, and she championed women's issues and rights. In 1975, two women, de Burka and Anderson, challenged the current Juries Act. The law had very strict requirements on who could serve as a juror. For instance, a property owner with a payable tax, excluding women almost entirely. Because of these restrictions, only 3 women served as jurors between 1963 and 1973. Thanks to Robinson's advocacy, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The newly amended law said any citizen between the ages of 18 and 65 could serve as a juror, thus eliminating the long discrimination of women.
So suddenly, women like me, if we're up for murder or whatever, we will have women on the jury.
Though an early party to the European Convention on Human Rights, Ireland was legally required to adhere to its standards, but the reality was different. Robinson encouraged Ireland to join the European Economic Community.
I felt that Ireland would benefit hugely from being a member of the European Economic Community, as it was then, now the European Union, because small countries can influence a bigger region, as happens and still happens. So I was very strongly in favour of Ireland joining, and I believe it has been very good for the country.
This had a seminal impact on human rights lawsuits thereafter. The Irish Constitution, under Catholic influence, prohibited divorce. Robinson represented a couple in court seeking the right to divorce and remarry. They were unsuccessful in Ireland, so they appealed to the European Court of Human Rights. Although they were unable to overturn the Irish court's decision, they did win the rights for their children born out of wedlock to be adopted.
We did manage to take a case that removed the illegitimacy of children, and a law was passed that you couldn't characterize children as illegitimate because their parents were not married.
In 1973 in Ireland, a woman named Josie Airy was unable to proceed with her lawsuit to seek a separation order from her husband. Since the government failed to provide civil legal aid, she petitioned the European Commission of Human Rights, which took up her case. The commission asked Robinson to represent Airy. The case drew much public interest. In 1979, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in Airy's favor. Free legal aid was subsequently made available in civil cases in Ireland. It was a very significant case.
means that there are ways in which the Irish state and its conduct can be held to account even above the courts in Ireland. It gives us yet another layer of international protection for basic human rights and rule of law norms.
Robinson was equally tireless in the fight for gay rights. Norris, a law classmate of hers at Trinity, was gay. He was later elected as a senator. He asked Robinson if she would represent him.
He asked me if I would take his case, and I was deeply honored to be asked. But I said to him, I remember saying to him, I need to know how you feel before I can take this case for you. You must write down for me what it's like to be gay in Ireland, to be a criminal, what it's like as a young person growing up with that. And he wrote me an incredible long letter about what it felt like, and that helped greatly bring the case for him, because I could then tell what the discrimination felt like, what the fear of prosecution felt like.
Robinson argued that the laws banning same-sex activities were unconstitutional as they infringed on people's private lives. However, it was unsuccessful. The Supreme Court in 1983 ruled 3-2 against Norris, stating that in Ireland, because it was Catholic, homosexuality was morally wrong, and that it exposed marriage to harm. The court deemed it constitutional to ban same-sex acts. Robinson then appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that the protection of private life in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights should include sexual behavior. Eventually, in 1988, the court ruled in favor of Norris.
And even though that didn't have the immediate effect of decriminalising homosexual conduct, it did lead several years later to the Irish legislature passing a bill removing that criminal prohibition in 1993. And that was both the court judgment and the subsequent legislative repeal of that law were major landmarks in the campaign for the rights of same-sex couples and homosexual people in Ireland.
In 1993, Robinson, as Ireland's first female president, signed into effect new criminal law that completely decriminalized homosexuality. It became one of her proudest moments. Robinson established herself as a defender of human rights in Irish society, and with her unmatched bravery, she was in the vanguard of her time.
Mary Robinson was years before her time. She actually fought battles 20 years, perhaps, before other people realized that she was right. And with that particular battle, she was up against this powerful institution, the Catholic Church, and there were very few men. All those men hid behind their rosary beads, and they let her stand out there and do the fighting, except for one or two exceptions. She was taking on the greatest power in the land, and nobody thought she could win, and she just kept at it. I think she returned to the law a real sense of its efficacy and of its ability to defend people. She returned a new dignity to the law in this country.
As subsequent developments have shown, her advocacy for Ireland's EU membership was prescient. Ireland's economy is now thriving, with per capita GDP surpassing that of the UK. Her push to join the EU not only boosted Ireland's economy, it also transformed Irish society in many ways.
President Robinson was an early and strong advocate of joining the European communities, what later became the European Union. She founded here the Irish Centre for European Law, which continues to exist and discusses and debates matters of European law and policy. And in so many areas, from women's right to work, to equal pay, to all sorts of other social and economic realities of Irish life, the European Union has transformed Irish law, Irish life, Irish society, and Irish people are still overwhelmingly positive about European Union membership and continuing Ireland's role as a good citizen of the European Union.
After her years in the Seanad, Robinson decided to retire and go back to being a lawyer and spending time with family. She never anticipated the next major turning point. In 1990, the leader of Ireland's Labour Party asked her to run for president. She was surprised and at first wanted to say no. She felt the presidency was out of touch with the public. Her husband Nicholas suggested she read how the presidency was defined in the Constitution. It was then that she reconsidered.
I read the oath of the president and I thought, you know, my goodness, somebody elected by the people of Ireland could do so much more at the local level, at the national level, and also at the international level.
She eventually ran as an independent. At first, no one thought she had a chance, and some even thought she had only a 1% chance of winning. But she wasn't concerned, nor did she put a lot of funds into the campaign, because after all, her goal wasn't to win.
Because I wasn't running to become president. I was running as a lawyer to make the case for how a president could do far more. And I really enjoyed that legal brief for a while. And then gradually I became very attracted to doing it myself. And then I realized that I was becoming more and more known and more popular, and that I had a chance to win. And then we went all out to win.
She ended up beating the odds and became Ireland's first female president. During a forum with young people in Taiwan, Robinson gave what she believed were the reasons for her victory.
When people say that I changed Ireland, I didn't change Ireland so much as give Ireland a recognition of how it was changing. Do you understand? You know, my election was almost symbolic of the changes that were happening, and I personified them because I had been so involved in taking cases, in speaking in the Senate, and doing so. They saw me, you know, and then it was easier as president to fulfill that.
Upon taking office, she began making good on campaign promises. She wanted to be a president for all. She engaged closely with local communities while working hard to reach out internationally. She was invited to visit Somalia, where there was a severe famine. Given Ireland's history in this regard, she was able to empathize. So she agreed to the visit. The Irish Constitution requires the president shall obtain government approval for leaving the state. She successfully made her case, and in 1992 she visited Somalia, the first foreign head of state to visit since the famine. Robinson, who is usually very composed, was making a statement after the visit, with her voice choked up, her compassion moving people deeply.
I have such a sense of what the world must take responsibility for. And by the world, I don't mean some distant sources. I mean each of us.
Robinson didn't prefer to reveal too much emotion, but she later came to understand that showing one's feelings can really move people.
Because I was a lawyer, I was trained to make the case in court, and I should have been able to make the case at the press conference without my voice beginning to break down and tears coming into my eyes. So I was cross with myself until I saw the replay, and then I saw how much more powerful it was. But that was not intended. And since then, and over the years, especially when I was High Commissioner, I have seen such terrible scenes that I find that I actually cry more easily. But I'm never happy when I cry. You know, I prefer not to.
The famine in Somalia gained wider concern after her visit. Her efforts were also recognized by Queen Elizabeth of the UK, who wrote to commend her and to invite her to England. In 1993, she accepted the invitation for an official visit and became the first sitting Irish president to visit England. This was a landmark journey of great significance.
That visit was about Ireland growing up in terms of its relationship with Britain, even though things in Northern Ireland were not totally sorted. At least to a certain extent, they have become so now. And I think that visit cheered so many people in Ireland, and it didn't matter how many nationalists objected, but everybody was pleased about that visit. It was terrific.
That very year, she also visited Northern Ireland, a trip that was even more controversial. Its people were mostly Protestant, and it was British territory. Its relationship with Ireland was tense indeed. But Robinson expressed her goodwill and her intention to build a good relationship with Northern Ireland. She actively welcomed groups from Northern Ireland to visit the president's residence in Dublin. They accepted and returned the invitation, which she accepted.
It was hard to do because neither the Irish government nor the British government wanted me to do it. But I felt very strongly that what I was doing was going to help a peace process. and I was going to do it. And then, of course, it helped greatly when the Irish people voted in that an opinion poll that they felt very strongly, 90% or something said this was the right thing to do.
Robinson's popularity was rivaled by few leaders. Her approval hit an unprecedented high, reaching 93%, mainly because her term redefined the presidency as a moral authority. She influenced not only all of Ireland, but also the world at large.
Mary Robinson transformed the role of the president in Irish political life. The Irish president has very few formal powers, a couple of important ones, but very, very limited, and largely existed as a ceremonial figure. And so while she respected the limits of the office of president, she didn't cross any serious lines and interfere with the workings of government or condemn the government of the day. She spoke in a way that inspired people and spoke about what Ireland could be, the place it could transform into. And I think it gave us a very different model of president. Rather than a largely silent elder statesman, this became a conscience of a nation, a place that people could look to and find their values reflected.
Robinson knew how to value tradition and self-discipline, which gave her a unique persuasiveness.
She always wore skirts. She wore suits. She wore jackets. She never really broke the convention of what you wear or how you behave. She was very strict about how she behaved as president. She stuck to many of the rules about protocol and about dress and about ceremony. She absolutely was respectful of ceremony and tradition. She understood symbolism and how to use symbolism, but she also knew she had to honor and respect the traditions of the presidency.
Moved by the struggles of the Irish people, who had to emigrate due to the country's difficulties and faced a tough time abroad, she placed an ever-burning candle in front of the president's residence. It gave the Irish diaspora everywhere a sense of belonging and became a symbol of her presidency.
You know, don't get into trouble, don't speak out, don't identify yourself. And suddenly here was this woman putting the light on them, shining a candle for them, telling them that they were welcome home, telling them they weren't forgotten about.
In 1997, just as her term was coming to an end, Robinson accepted the invitation of UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to serve as the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights. She had already decided not to seek another term as president and did not want to miss such a rare opportunity. She stepped down 2.5 months before her term ended, which was a regret in her career.
I didn't appreciate at the time, but it became evident. The Irish people were really very upset that I did not serve out the full term. And in fact, it became very evident that they felt I was somehow almost using the presidency to get a better job. Little did they know that the job of High Commissioner was the most difficult job I have ever done. And so much so that it nearly broke my health after a few months because it was so hard. But that's another story. But it was a mistake that I admit very publicly now, that I didn't serve out my full term since I had been elected by the people for that 7 years.
It is hard for people to imagine the complex role of the High Commissioner. One must engage in a vast bureaucracy while having limited power at hand. Shortly after taking office, Robinson faced a challenge.
I took office as High Commissioner in September 1997, and I discovered there was a really important year coming up, 1998, which was the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And China wanted a visit by the High Commissioner, and I wanted to visit China. So I was in a position to negotiate. So I said I would only visit China if they would allow me to go to Tibet. Oh, no, 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 no. And I said, yes, 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 no, no, no.
As the visit date approached, Robinson learned through negotiations that China, once invaded by Western imperial powers, was sensitive to visits from Western officials. She explained to them that Ireland had also been hemmed in by strong powers and that she did not hold an imperialist mindset. In the end, she persuaded them to let her visit Tibet. During her tenure as High Commissioner of Human Rights, she visited China 6 times in all, which she felt to be very important.
Why? Because I recognized that China was not fulfilling the full human rights, particularly the human rights that Western countries emphasize, which is civil and political rights. But it was moving to take people out of poverty. It was moving on economic and social rights. And I wanted to be firm on one, but recognize the other.
She also frequently visited Africa and returned to Somalia. But unlike her previously warm welcome, the current visit was in a different role, and she sensed some skepticism. She realized her new position lacked the power to make changes in other countries, and so she shifted the focus to listening to the voices of victims.
All I could do was use my voice and my moral authority and listen to victims of violations. So I would go to places, for example, Chechnya, Grozny in Chechnya, which was being destroyed. And I went and spoke to the foreign minister and came back to the commission, and they passed a resolution against Russia, a P5 country, a human rights resolution. It had never happened before, and Russia were very angry.
Another instance was during a visit to Goma, a major city in eastern Congo, where ongoing conflict had resulted in widespread sexual violence against women. Some women had been violated multiple times, their bodies even mutilated. Robinson sat with the victims, and the atmosphere grew quiet, deeply sad and solemn. She then made a request.
Would you do me a favor? And they were very surprised. And I said, would you just sing for me? Because I know they all sing. And they would begin with a low song, very sad. And then they would begin to move, and I would begin to move, and we would begin to move together. And they would realize, and they would start standing, and we would start dancing together. And I would leave them feeling better about themselves. A tiny thing, but something. So you go from trying to do political things to trying to do very personal, small things to make a difference.
Her most contentious moment as High Commissioner happened during the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. Countries pursued a declaration and actions against racism. The conference was held in Durban, South Africa, recognizing the country's history of apartheid. Many sympathized with the situation in Palestine and wanted language in the declaration equating Zionism with racism, which resulted in backlash from Jewish groups. Though Robinson felt some groups' actions were extreme, she was still labeled as anti-Semitic.
But in fact it wasn't, because they identified apartheid and what was happening in Gaza with some justification, but the way it was done was very anti-Semitic, very racist. And the civil society marches were using language which I totally disagreed with and disapproved of. But because I was the High Commissioner, I was tagged with by some Congress members in the United States who said, this is your conference and it's anti-Semitic, therefore you're to blame.
The incident was intensely frustrating for her because the conference established the important Durban Declaration and Program of Action. While it came after much compromise, it was still significant as it marked the first time that a global consensus on anti-racism was reached. However, it didn't get the recognition it deserved. Her 4-year term as High Commissioner was nearing its end. Having initially struggled and having a hard time adapting to the bureaucracy after immense effort, Robinson grew to love the job.
I had a very difficult start. The job almost broke me. I nearly had a mental breakdown, it was so difficult. And then I gradually came to love it, and to love working with my very brave human rights officers, staff, etc., and work on human rights. But at the end of the 4 years, I thought, I signaled that I wouldn't seek a second term. And there was such an outpouring of you must, that I decided to do 1 more year. And that year started on 9/11.
The 9/11 attacks shifted the mood in American society. Citing national security, the U.S. failed to respect many of its human rights commitments. On this issue, Robinson did not hesitate to raise questions.
That was a difficult year because I had to keep addressing the fact that the United States was not upholding its commitments under the Covenant Against Torture, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, etc. So I was holding them to account for what they had committed to, and they didn't like it.
One of the things Robinson did was to write a report criticizing the U.S. handling of Guantanamo Bay prisoners. It made a strong impression on the public. The report also reflected her fearless habit of confronting the powers that be.
Pursues justice so effectively in these issues that she has managed to have such a successful and decorated career while never backing away from a difficult truth or a tough issue or an issue that would make her unpopular in certain quarters. It always, I think, was primary for her to pursue truth and justice as she saw it.
It was for this reason that she couldn't secure U.S. support to stay in her role, so Annan had to appoint someone else.
I think in all her time in the UN, the attitude of the US administration was a problem for her. And she called it out and probably had to pay the price for that.
Even so, for a small country like Ireland, having their beloved president in such an important role was a tremendous honor and a point of pride.
Her tenure as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was so hugely important, both in terms of the countries she chose to visit, the issues she chose to engage in, and the way that she brought a vibrancy to that role, much as she had done to the Irish presidency. And I think, again, for Ireland to be represented on the world stage by such a high-profile commissioner was, again, I think hugely important for Ireland as a nation, to see an Irish person representing rule of law and human rights values at that level.
After stepping down as High Commissioner of Human Rights, she became the first female Chancellor of Trinity College Dublin and was the Reid Chair in Law at Trinity College Dublin, a position with practical and symbolic importance.
And it is perhaps one of the most important positions in any Irish law school because it has been held by pioneering women in the legal profession.
It was the example set by Robinson that inspired him and so many other young people to study law.
And I think as I grew up, thinking about law and using the law as a tool to try and make society more just, I think Mary Robinson was always an inspiration. And I think if you were to ask the law students I teach now, when they come here at 18 years old, why they chose to study law, and particularly those who want to pursue a career in human rights and want to make a difference, I'm very sure Mary Robinson would be very high on their list of people who inspired them to do it.
In 2007, she was invited to join the Elders as a founding member, a group founded by former South African President Nelson Mandela, whose mission is to unite global leaders in working for peace and human rights and addressing the world's most challenging problems, one being climate change. Robinson admitted she hadn't focused much on this issue. It was her role as a UN Special Envoy on climate change and her visits to Africa that led to her taking on climate justice.
Working in African countries on those rights to food and water and health and education, and I was honorary president of Oxfam, that I suddenly saw, and women would say to me, is God punishing us? We don't understand, because the rainy seasons don't come when they should. We have long periods of drought and then flash flooding that destroyed the school and the village, etc. And they were, distraught and no insurance, nothing to pay for it. And I realized the injustice of climate. That was what struck me, and I had missed this.
So in 2010, she established the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice, an organization dedicated to advocating for climate justice. Climate change issues often hit the most vulnerable groups hardest and manifest in various ways.
The first injustice is that the climate and nature crisis has affected much earlier and disproportionately the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island developing states, and the indigenous peoples, much earlier and much more severely than more developed countries. Secondly, women are deeply affected, much more, by the climate impacts. whether it's heat, whether it's flooding, whether it's drought, etc. And then you have the intergenerational injustice that I already mentioned, that young people, young climate activists, are becoming more and more anxious because they have been campaigning for change and the change is not happening. There's also the injustice to future generations not yet born. What kind of world will they have if we don't move, if we don't change?
Robinson felt a practical approach was needed to tackle the issues effectively.
That climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution. And I always make it clear that I mean feminism for men and boys as well. Feminism is a way of doing, which is coming to your question. If you look at the women's movement, it's much less hierarchical. It's more a group coming together, listening to each voice, sharing the experience, and then being very practical about how to change things, how to make a difference. Not abstract theorizing, but practical problem solving. And that, I think, is what we need in our world.
Robinson was extremely popular with a profound ability to motivate. Still, she avoided the spotlight, shifting the attention to grassroots leaders instead.
The emphasis was always on listening to grassroots women and understanding their unique leadership within their community, and the fact that these women leaders were able to identify the solutions that they needed themselves, and then what the women in positions of leadership at national level or at multilateral level were able to do was then really bring that context into the negotiations.
Aware of symbolism and its importance, she launched an initiative, Project Dandelion, and she wore a dandelion brooch in all her public appearances.
Why the dandelion? Because it grows on all continents. It's very resilient. You can't get rid of it if you want to. And, you know, I grew up thinking it was a weed and wanting to get rid of it. Now I think it's a beautiful flower, but it is very resilient. It will come back. It will grow in cracks. It will, you know, it's a very strong. And then, because it has deep roots, it is regenerative of the soil. And how do you spread it? You just blow the seed. So we feel we need a nature symbol because we are nature, but we're becoming too divorced from nature, and we need to regroup with nature and be part of nature.
Initially focused on women, this climate initiative now aims to bring together people from all walks of life. Farmers, fishermen, scientists, entrepreneurs, artists, and others.
Grow our sense of connection, grow our sense of communication, begin to message in the same way, and switch the money. Put the pressure to have more of the money go to grassroots building resilience, young people trying to get the green jobs, you know, the kind of move from the way the world works at the moment to a much better way. I think this to me would be the game changer.
Thanks to her legal background and many different roles and experiences, Robinson was among the few leaders able to link climate change with human rights issues.
And that was one of the key legacies of Mary's work in the foundation and continued in the elders, was to be able to marry those two communities. So understanding that climate change undermines human rights, but so too can climate action if it's not human rights informed. And that's the real kind of simple, powerful message of climate justice.
Former U.S. Vice President Al Gore praised Robinson for being the strongest voice on both climate justice and human rights. In 2018, she became Chair of the Elders. She pointed out three main crises that humanity faces.
We have identified three existential threats: the climate and nature crisis, the pandemic crisis, because we're still not learning the lessons of COVID, of how to deal with the next pandemic, and thirdly, the nuclear weapons crisis. And then across those is the potential for good or ill of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence. Very worrying, especially for nuclear weapons, but really across all three.
In her public outreach, she discovered the value of humor in getting messages across. Her husband Nick was a political cartoonist, and their marriage was witty and fun. She also learned to unwind from the admired Archbishop Tutu.
I mean, I am very shy internally. I've got over it. I've learned not to show my shyness, but it's still there. But I've now, I quite often, you know, when I'm asked to go onto a stage, I dance onto the stage, just like Archbishop Tutu would have. And I always get a kind of laugh, and it's exactly the same thing. It's to just, you know, get people to be at ease.
She also learned not to lose hope. She recalled a journalist once asking Archbishop Tutu how he was so optimistic. His answer resonated with her.
Oh no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope. And that to me, really, I just felt it in my gut, how important that is. And more and more I can see it. If you're a prisoner of hope, you see a bit of light, you see a bit, you know, the glass may not be even half full, but you see something there and you build on that and you make something of it and you go forward and you build more. Having this attitude of being a prisoner of hope is actually extremely important. It's extremely important to give people hope, to have the positive narrative, to make it happen, and it will happen.
Robinson was delighted upon receiving the Tang Prize in Rule of Law.
I was really very humbled that it was rule of law. You know, that really struck me as being so important in our world today, more than ever before, and more undermined, more disregarded, more swept away as if it was nothing. So we have to reaffirm extraordinarily strongly rule of law. And I just felt, you know, particularly honoured, but also humbled by that being the category that I was being awarded for.
In her acceptance speech at the Tang Prize award ceremony, Robinson passionately declared that upholding the rule of law is the responsibility of all citizens, not just leaders.
And equally important, what can all of us as citizens do to hold our leaders accountable and stand up for good governance and respect for rule of law at home and around the world? I must confess that it's been a challenge to rise to the defense of rule of law in our world today, but a challenge I have taken on with total conviction. Indeed, receiving an award in the name of rule of law is the greatest honour I could think of, and I again offer you my warm personal thank you. Thank you very much.
When Robinson turned 80 in 2024, a documentary about her life premiered in Ireland. Young people attended the premiere and eagerly joined the post-watch discussion. Her story inspired women to go beyond female-specific issues and resonate with all humanity.
But no matter where you are in the world, we're all interconnected, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's what's going on in Gaza, injustice, things like that are happening. And Mary really has kind of brought that message forward to people in Ireland and around the world. So yeah, it's really inspiring.
Mary Robinson has always held tight to her convictions. Just like the title of her autobiography, Robinson believes that everybody matters, and law is the foundation on which she built up that belief.